Good morning everyone. Welcome to today's session on the NPTEL course Indian Fiction and English. We look at this short story by Githa Hariharan titled Remains of the Feast, and we base this lecture focusing on some of the interesting ways in which Indian fiction can be read. We had been taking a look at different frameworks through which we can approach in this body of writing known as Indian fiction in English. Today we particularly look at one essay by Susie Tharu, which is read the remains of the feast in the context of a comparative reading by comparing this short story with another short story written by a Dalit writer. The short story Remains of the Feast is from this collection published in 1992 by Githa Hariharan titled The Art of Dying. In this collection, there are a set of stories, a series of stories where she look at death as something natural. The focus is on the attitude of the dying and not on the funeral rites or rituals. And she also takes into account the reactions of the living towards the dying. The entire collection has been much applauded, and it has been seen as a different way of looking at death. Not necessarily always in a mournful, lamenting way, but also looking at death from the perspective of life. Remains of the Feast, incidentally, is also the short story anthologized by Ratna, vintage book of Indian writing, the controversial introduction of which we also had taken a look at in one of the introductory sessions. And this is how he introduces Githa Hariharan along with the other contemporary writers. It is Padma Perera, Anjana Appachana and Githa Hariharan, who according to him are less well known than Sidhwa and Mehta, but they confirm the quality of contemporary writing by Indian women. So this can be taken as a representative text in that sense, where we look at the quality of Indian writing produced by women. This story is about a 90-year-old grandmother who remains unnamed, and her story is narrated by Ratna, her great-granddaughter. This is about their special bonding and the many minute details that we get to know in this process of narration. This is how Ratna, the great-granddaughter, talks about the relation she has with her grandmother. We were not exactly roommates, but we shared two rooms, one corner of the old ancestral house all my 20-year-old life. The narration begins, interestingly, after the grandmother's death the previous month. So it's a selective recollection of certain significant things that happened in this great-grandmother's life, especially towards the end of her life. That this narration is from the perspective of younger generation, and that about two generations have passed in between makes this rendition all the more interesting. The grandmother had died of cancer. But what becomes central to this plot, central to the progress of the story, is not the event which comes in the form of cancer, but the way in which the great-grandmother begins to respond after she's been diagnosed with cancer. The family tries to keep this away from her. They diagnose her with a cancer, but they also think that it would be wise to keep this away from her as a secret. They also decide not to let the extended family know, to provide, to avoid a series of visitations from them. While Ratna, the great-granddaughter, fears that the great-grandmother will call her and ask her about what the doctor had suggested, we find that the great-grandmother, the figure of this Brahmin widow, she chooses to completely ignore the visit made to the doctor. She chooses completely not to talk about the visit to the doctor. On the other hand, she begins to crave for all kinds of forbidden food, all kinds of food which were taboo for her due to caste restrictions. And this is how Ratna talks about this sudden shift. She's a Brahmin widow who had never eaten anything but pure home-cooked food for almost a century. And we find that all of a sudden, without any immediate provocation, the great-grandmother begins to crave for different kinds of things. Cakes from a Christian shop made by a Muslim cook, for Coca-Cola, ice creams, biscuits, samosas. Yeah? And this there is a way in which the desire begins to present itself in more varied forms and more articulate forms. She begins to crave for lemon tarts, garlic, 3 types of aerated drinks. Fruit cakes are baked with a brandy. bhelpuri from the fly-infested bazaar nearby. So she's willing to break out of all kinds of caste restrictions and also the notions of purity, pollution, the notions related to hygiene. And there is an interesting way in which this narration takes us forward through these graphic representations of the newfound desires and the newfound cravings that the great grandmother has. And the climax comes across as all the more interesting. This is presented almost like a death wish. This is the last statement that the great grandmother uttered before she died. She asked for a red color sari with a big wide border of gold, and she also craves for peanuts with chili powder from the corner shop, and onion and green chili bondas deep fried in oil. This comes across as very significant. When she asks for the red sari, of course, Ratna, the great granddaughter, she agrees because she has been a partner for fulfilling all of these newfound desires and cravings. But her mother, Ratna's mother, who comes across as more conventional, she rubbishes this wish off, and they do not drape her in the red colored sari during the funeral. You can find certain allusions with some other characters. I am reminded of the character of Baby Kochama from The God of Small Things, where she is living like a young woman at the age of 83. Rahel, one of the twins, she notices that Baby Kochama had suddenly begun to wear makeup, lipstick, kohl, a slight touch of rouge, and because the house was locked and dark and because she only believed in 40-watt bulbs, her lipstick mouth had shifted slightly off her real mouth. These are certain interesting ways in which Indian fiction portrays desire in the context of aging, desire in the context of gender, and desire in the context of breaking out of certain taboos and breaking out of certain social conventions within which they were always forced to, within which the women were always forced to live. There is a subtle humour which marks this story, The Remains of the Feast. Right at the outset, we get a taste of how Githa Hariharan is going to process this story, going to present this story. We know that it is about death, but the title implies otherwise. It's about the remains of a feast, and we are told about the death of the grandmother, which happened the previous month. And soon after that, while talking about the early demise of her son and her daughter-in-law, and the way the 90-year-old grandmother survived all of them, Githa Hariharan resorts to this interesting narrative strategy where she infuses humour into this otherwise not so humorous situation. That she, an ignorant village-bred woman who signed the papers my father brought her with a thumbprint, should survive, while they, city-bred ambitious, should collapse of weak hearts and arthritic knees at the first sign of old age. She's bringing in a contrast between tradition and modernity, and also about the differing views of health. And that Ratna is a medical student herself, that accentuates the irony of this situation. And the grandmother, the great grandmother, this 90-year-old widow, she is presented in a very different way, not like the way in which usually 90-year-old widows are presented. She is said to be giggling like a girl, and there's a brief description of how she could fart exactly like a train whistling, and about how the grandmother, as far as Ratna could remember, at least in the last 20 years, she was always cheerful and never sick. So this is how the figure of the grandmother, the figure of this 90-year-old Brahmin widow is presented before us. And this is a very different kind of rendition, but at the same time, the natural language and the naturality with which Githa Hariharan presents this image, it does not come across as being a big deal. Hariharan talks about this 90-year-old Brahmin widow as if this could also be the norm. Particularly find it interesting that Githa Hariharan's story has brought together the aspects of desire, gender in the context of food. I read to you this excerpt from the story where the grandmother is actually responding to food, but the kind of terms used, the description used, the flow with which language goes here, it talks about a different kind of a carnal desire as well. This is how the excerpt reads. "Ooh," she would moan, her little pink tongue darted out and licked at the frosting. Her toothless mouth worked its way steadily, munching, making happy sucking noises. Our secret was safe for about a week. Then she became bold. She became a little adventurous every day. Her cravings were various and unpredictable, laughable and always urgent. Look at the sexual undertone over here, where Hariharan also makes his bold attempt to bring in desire and food in the context of this almost end of the life scenario of a 90-year-old widow. The story would easily come across as a feel-good read, as one of those stories that you can read, feel good and perhaps even forget about, notwithstanding the happy feeling that it would leave behind you. It's in this context that I introduce you to a critical reading by Susie Tharu, where she focuses on this story from a different angle, from a different perspective altogether. Tharu's essay was first published in EPW in June 1996. It's titled The Impossible Subject, Caste and the Gendered Body. And I bring this reading to you to also showcase the multiple ways in which you can enter the writings produced from Indian fiction in English and to see how they can also be made to lend themselves to aspects which are not really centrally part of the story. And this is what Tharu's essays will do to you, and I hope this will also open up newer avenues for you to look at Indian fiction more critically. This is the context in which Tharu presents her essay. She talks about how the figure of the Hindu widow in Indian literatures have always found to be looming large. She recalls how she noticed that even while she was co-editing Women Writing in India along with K. Lalita. She talks about, very briefly, she talks about the widow stories and their framing within this nationalist context. And she also makes this succinct statement: after all, when one thinks of a widow, one thinks of a Hindu widow. In the last century, no more than now, one means a Brahmin widow. This is the entry point for Tharu's discussion, where she brings into focus two major stories. One, Remains of the Feast by Githa Hariharan, and the other, Mother by Baburao Bagul. And she first talks about Githa Hariharan's story, The Remains of the Feast. She refers to the minimal plot, which she also agrees is something which is intended to be enjoyed in passing. And then she marks her intervention with this statement: the seriousness with which I approach this text is a misreading. And this is what makes this reading extremely important and extremely significant and different, because Tharu is able to bring in a very serious reading into this story, which could otherwise be perhaps put away as yet another story which just made you feel good. Susie Tharu's reading forces us to look at the story from a different perspective. She tells us that this is a typical widow in a certain way. It's a costumed 19th century subject of the colonial social reform movements. But what makes the grandmother figure, the Brahmin widow figure in this story different, is the fact that she's not presented as a victim of a cruel, superstitious society. And this is quite unlike her predecessor, who had to fight it out through various colonial and nationalist reform movements. She does not really recall the history of those movements, but she in a certain way invokes those colonial nationalist straitjackets within which these reform movements were placed initially. She enables us to look at the widow, the figure of the widow, as a personhood that exceeds discipline. It is the figure of the widow, a Brahmin widow, which we get to know through many markers, but interestingly and significantly, not the widow figure who is a victim of a caste-ridden society. How is this personhood made to exceed discipline and come out of these barriers of propriety and discipline? Githa Hariharan includes these very interesting and hilarious situations through which she allows this Brahmin widow, allows this figure of the grandmother to make farting a musical event or to produce indecorous laughter. And there is talk about body odors without really making it sound offensive. What happens here by introducing certain indecorous ways of performing within the family, within the society. What Githa Hariharan does is to force certain caste gender taboos and middle class propriety to move aside. And it's in that space where the grandmother figure pushes aside all kinds of propriety and taboos. It's in that space that she begins to exist and enjoy this feast. And what becomes central to this plot, central to this entire storyline, is this grossly irreverent appetite, which also comes across as being irrelevant at times. And how this is accommodated in the story without really disturbing the family status, without really disturbing the caste status. That is what Susie Tharu is interested in looking at. And Ratna, who is merely a narrator, a modern figure in the story, Susie Tharu sees her as a mirror image of this figure of the grandmother. And we also find a certain way in which the great grandmother's desires, the openness with which the great grandmother expresses her desires, and the young woman's own contemporary appetites and deprivations are presented. There is a brief instance where Ratna talks about how she should be devouring her books, while that night she would rather prefer to cuddle with her grandmother. And there is a way in which we find some kind of a tussle between the personal desires, the personal space, and the expectations that the society and the family also comes in. Ratna is also not presented as a female who is oppressed within a certain restrictive system. She, on the contrary, comes across as someone who has enough freedom to bring in, to fulfill the cravings that her great grandmother has. Of course, her mother does not agree with all the things that she's been doing, but nevertheless, we do find that Ratna is given the space to move around and do certain things. And what's significant even at this point is that we do not find things being unsettled in a major way. The status quo is maintained in terms of gender, in terms of caste, in terms of the societal structure. Tharu will soon also show us how she looks at this status quo from a different perspective altogether. Susie Tharu successfully brings in a feminist reading to this story. And in her own words, this story is read as an intervention in a long-standing debate in Indian feminism. And if you are familiar with the plot of the story, if you've already read the story, which is barely 6 to 7 pages, it's difficult to find any articulation of a political feminism over here. So what kind of a feminist statement is being made here? Tharu forces us to look at the feminist body in the figure of this old Brahmin widow. And here she also reminds us to focus, pay attention to the fact that unlike the usual rhetoric, unlike the usual conventional narrative, the enemy here is not patriarchy, but a social world that fails to sustain this new spirit that the great grandmother brings in. And it's a different kind of feminism in that sense. Here the victim is the fleshly nature, not women. The cravings, the desires, and the new kind of appetite, this grossly irreverent appetite the figure of the great grandmother develops, becomes perhaps unacceptable or even a little obscene for a more conventional gaze. It's not just because she's a woman, it's also because it's an articulation of the fleshly nature. So what is being victimized here is a body and not necessarily a feminist body. And this shift that Tharu notices from patriarchy to a social order, to a social world, is peculiarly interesting in looking at the story from a fresh perspective, and also in bringing in a fresh approach for feminist reading. And she moves on to lead us to the caste politics of the story, which is subtle, which is not right on your face. There is of course the figure of the Hindu Brahmin widow, but that does not necessarily alert us to look at caste. And here is where Tharu's reading comes into play a significant role, where she unravels the superficial understanding and then forces us to look at the inherent caste politics here as well. Tharu tells us how we are able to know about the upper caste status, about the family, in terms of the minute details which come through. The family owns property in the village, and we get to know that they were also part of the Indian officialdom for 2 generations. The son, this grandmother's son was an administrator, the grandson an accountant, and the great granddaughter Ratna, we get to know, is studying medicine. So there is a way in which they have been incorporated into the many benefits of the newfound state. And the hunger and cravings that this grandmother has all of a sudden, in Tharu's words, the hunger and cravings have been updated to include others excited by the more modern pruderies of a colonial middle class. For instance, alcohol or street food, body noises, makeup, female desire. These are the things which would come across as being inappropriate and, in Tharu's words, grossly irreverent. It comes across as irreverent or gross or being out of place only when you look at it within the context of the way in which the colonial middle class emerged. It comes across as taboo when you place it in a certain context. It's not, these are not items which are inherently taboo, which are inherently evil, but when the subject position of this grandmother, of this widow, expects her to behave in a different way, and when she ends up articulating things which really do not sit in comfortably well with the subject position, it becomes taboo, it becomes irreverent and gross. And the family's modernity also is exemplary. We do not find them practicing any kind of caste or gender based discrimination, and the way in which they are able to allow, they are able to accommodate the newfound desires and cravings of the grandmother, and how the young daughter, the young female in the family is allowed to go and pursue medicine, allowed to go and study medicine. These are certain markers of the exemplary nature of the family's modernity. But this is also about the scope of an Indian modernity that can perhaps accommodate tradition without compromising its humanism. So we find them being traditional, rooted in the caste rituals. Otherwise, there is no need for them to talk about that. Otherwise, there is no need for Ratna to be shocked at the scandalous new desires and the cravings that the grandmother is expressing. Had this been a normal thing in their family, there was no need for Ratna to smuggle these forbidden food from the street into the space of this Brahmin home. But at the same time, it's not a family who's willing to compromise his humanism to preserve certain age-old traditions. We find a fine mix which makes this family and these characters endearing to us. But what interests Susie Tharu is the way in which this is placed politically in the context of the modern state. And talking about the way in which they accommodate tradition without compromising humanism, Tharu refers to the way in which they bring in a doctor and not a priest when this grandmother is dying, when the grandmother is about to fall sick, and there is no opposition for studying medicine. There are no caste occupations, there are no prescriptions about what one should do in this modern society. We find here a very close fit between tradition and modernity and Brahmanism and secularism. These could be dichotomous concepts, but we find this sitting together very comfortably in this family, and by extension in perhaps any typical Indian middle class modern family which also has a relatively upper caste status. And how do we engage with the question of caste in this context? Tharu reminds us that caste makes an appearance here as caste system and not as caste discrimination, oppression, or any other form of things that we would rather not associate with. This is in stark contrast with the way in which we have looked at caste within the space of Indian English fiction. We have been looking at caste when it makes an appearance in the form of untouchability, when it makes an appearance in the form of a practice which essentially becomes violent or violating. But here, Tharu is able to identify caste as a system, as a hierarchy, which it was originally meant to be. And in Tharu's words, the older woman, the image, the figure of this Brahmin widow, she is able to break the hold of caste by consuming the proscribed food, thereby consuming her way to freedom. In this caste system, there is this freedom, there is this allowance which is there, the mobility to break the hold of caste by doing certain things, by being a part of the globalized consumerist culture in a minimal way, though she is able to break out of the things which were originally restricting her. And this Tharu finds very fascinating and interesting. And this transition, which is what Tharu begins to focus on, this transition from Brahminism tradition to secularism modernity, it comes across as being very smooth. If you recall, Tharu had already referred to the way in which tradition and modernity, there is a close fit, and in Brahminism and secularism there is a close fit. But when the grandmother begins to express certain forbidden desires and express these irreverent cravings, we find that this transition from the Brahminical traditional self to the secular modern self, it is being accommodated without any crisis. There is no reason to presume any substantial conflict within the family, even when we know that the Ratna, the great granddaughter, she had to smuggle in food. We do not find it leading to any major conflict within the family or in their immediate social circle. And this transition is what makes the caste and the modernity of this modern secular family important for Tharu's reading, because there are certain things available to them because of their hierarchical positioning in the caste system, and those transitions which are easily made available to them are perhaps not really available to the ones who are in the lower rungs of this hierarchy. This transition becomes easier on account of the way they are placed in this system of caste divisions. Tharu takes us to the second story in this, which is discussed in this essay, which is Baburao Bagul's mother, where she talks about the drama of life and death in the scene of an untouchable family. Yeah. As this is also slightly outside the scope of our course of discussion, we will not get into the details of the second story and how a comparative analysis is brought in. But the implications of Tharu's essay, the implications of reading these two works together, as Tharu herself lays them out, towards a conclusion, Tharu argues, it seems to me that the stories represent two of the most powerful contesting forces within feminism today. On the one hand, the pressures of a re-empowered middle class whose fund bank aspirations are global and who must remake its humanism to suit. On the other, the questions raised by the Dalit movement, terrifying and full of promise. One thing that we can perhaps take away from this reading, from this different, unique kind of reading, is the need to bring in other frameworks to look at the writings produced by Indian fiction in English. The need to bring in a comparative outlook, the need to look at concepts such as feminism from an altogether different perspective, the need to look at something like caste, which has been seen in a redundant fashion, but to totally reinvent and totally reshape and refashion the perspectives with which one can approach the many concepts and the many themes which are presented within this space. And this is perhaps would widen the scope of our reading and also help us to read across cultures, read across texts and translations and languages. Yeah. And these approaches would also perhaps begin to bridge this undeniable gap which as of now exists between Indian fiction written in English and the other literatures, other kinds of fiction and other kinds of literatures which are produced and published in different languages within India. And I hope this reading has been useful for you. I hope that you will be able to access the short story as well as Susie Tharu's critical take on it to see how it is possible to bring in perspectives which are not sitting comfortably well with this space, which are challenging certain frameworks and certain concepts within which Indian fiction is forced to survive and forced to thrive. I thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next session.